I'll see you guys in the dark.
I live in a middle to low-class neighborhood in the Caribbean. It's a quiet place where nothing ever happens. The type of place where people go and retire to and sip pina coladas all day. However, a few houses next to mine lived a family that was not like the rest. They had the biggest house on the street and lived luxuriously. Their kids would play with me, especially the smallest girl we all nicknamed Tiny. Tiny was about 5 when I was 11, and she was always at my house. I knew my mom and the neighbors were concerned about a 5-year-old being all day outside and not arriving at her house until midnight on school days. But it was a quiet place where nothing ever happened, so no one got worried. When Tiny turned 6, her parents threw a giant birthday party for her, and all of the neighbor kids were invited. I wanted to go. They had bouncy houses, water slides, and everything a kid would want to play with, but my parents didn't allow me to go. I never knew why. I suppose it was because my mom didn't know her mom. I remember feeling very sad because everyone was there and I was playing alone at my house. After the birthday, things went back to normal, and one day we were all playing and talking about what our parents did for work. We asked Tiny and her siblings, but none of them knew what they did except he traveled a lot and was always at meetings. I didn't pay much attention, and we all continued on with our day. One night, we were playing on the street when we started hearing loud pops coming from Tiny's house. I will never forget that day. The neighbors, including my mom, came out rushing us inside, yelling that it was gunshots. Some of us got in the house, and we stayed there as my next-door neighbor, who was a cop, ran towards Tiny's house. All we saw after the gunshots were a black van rushing down the street, and it almost killed a dog. Some men entered the house. Tiny and her siblings wanted to check on what was going on, but everyone forbade them to go. All I remember was a bunch of cops and ambulances a few minutes later. And in a day, I never saw Tiny or her siblings again. For a couple of months, the house sat empty, but black vans and strange men kept coming into the neighborhood door to door asking for any information about the man and his children. No one in the neighborhood spoke about it. I know the cops asked me about Tiny and the kids, and if they ever said something weird about his dad and mom, but I was only 11 and more concerned about playing Mario Kart Wii than about what happened that night. Years passed, and the story faded away. Now that I am grown up, I asked my neighborhood cop what went down that night, as there were many rumors the guy died. He said that night the man got a gun emptied into his skull and his wife was gravely wounded, but she survived, because he was a drug lord that was going to make a deal with the police to turn his rival gangs and some other people to the cops. The men in the van that were going door to door wanted to know where his kids and wife were to also shut them up. As to the kids, his oldest son was found dead a few hours away in the neighboring town. His car set ablaze. His other children are now living in other countries under witness protection programs. I just hope, wherever Tiny is, she's doing okay, and her family got the help that they needed. I did find a link to the news and asked my neighbor about it to give more details on it. The wife was shot in the leg, and it made her cause massive blood loss. But overall, she's fine. This was the first major news on my town besides the Comoy massacre in the 70s, when a prominent woman was hatched to death alongside her adult daughter by the daughter's husband. The news are in Spanish. Also, I got an update on Tiny. She's fine. I don't know in which country she is, but by the time she has called in the neighbors in the past a few years ago, she's been doing fine and has a kid as well. This happened at the last house my mother, sister, and I were renting in. The house had changed hands every year or so, and it belonged to a renting company, rather than a regular landlord. So it didn't have any information about the previous residents of the place. But it was in a decent neighborhood. so we didn't think it was necessary to check anything. About 8 months after moving in, last January, I was playing video games in the office on a Saturday night. At about midnight or so, when I was startled by an aggressively loud banging on our front door. The rapping was so hard, it sounded like the door would fly off its hinges, and it echoed through the entire house, loud enough that my mother could hear it in her room with the door closed and with music on. Now we all know that it is never a good thing when someone bangs on your door that hard in the middle of the night, but that didn't stop my badass mother from racing downstairs and beating me to the door to see what the hell was happening, and answered it by pulling the blinds from the window next to the door, revealing a man who looked to be in his 20s standing very close to the door. When she asked him what he was doing, he replied that he was looking for someone named Jamal. Nobody knew a guy with that name, so she told them nobody was there. The guy kept persisting, with my mother continuing to insist that the person they were looking for didn't live here. After a few minutes, my mother would later tell me that there was another guy who appeared from the left, coming around from the side of the house where some windows were. It became very clear that they were checking for Jamal in case my mother was lying or something. Thankfully, they eventually left. The next morning, I took our car to drive to work and noticed that it wasn't driving right. As I was sliding all around the lane, I didn't pay too much attention to it. However, because it snowed a few days prior and there was still ice on the road in some places, so I assumed that there was still some black ice. It wasn't until someone in the parking lot of the store I worked at flagged me down and told me that 2 of my tires were losing air and flatting out. I carefully drove back home and told my mother what happened with the tires, and it finally clicked. The angry knocking at midnight, that aggressive demand for a guy we didn't know, the guy scouting around the corner of our house, likely looking in the windows. They slashed all of our tires, which means they were likely armed with, at a very least, knives. The thought of them not believing us and breaking in still haunts me to this day, because we wouldn't have had a way to fight back if they chose to keep looking. It's the first time I've ever felt completely helpless. A few weeks later, we got a package for someone who was a previous tenant, and a guy came looking for it, after assuming it was delivered to their old residence. Turns out, that guy was Jamal's older brother. We told him what happened, and he seemed completely blindsided by the information, as if that was the first time he'd learned about his little brother maybe being involved with the wrong crowd. I don't know what happened afterwards, but hopefully the revelation led to Jamal getting some help. We also got some free tires out of the deal, so it wasn't a total loss. But I'd rather not see those 2 guys ever again, especially in the middle of the night. We moved out a couple of months later just to get away. I think the person who had my phone number before me was both a deadbeat and in with the wrong crowd, because I consistently get harassed by credit industries looking for this guy, Juan, who isn't me, and I get crazy texts asking for Juan. This was normal in the beginning, and over time, it started to die down. After having my phone number for 6 years, I was getting a call from this strange number with the same area code, but they were calling every 5 to 10 minutes. Normally I would block it, but it was the same number every time, so I was going to wait to Google the number to verify if it was spam. Before I could get to Google, I got a text from the number that was calling me earlier that simply just said, "Puto." Now, I'm as white as cream cheese, but I knew what that meant. Usually at this point, I would just ignore it and then block the message. But I was intrigued because it wasn't a message promising me hot Russian singles in my area. So I decided to Google some Spanish comebacks and insults and proceeded to barrage the messenger with some salty Spanish lingo. Needless to say, the messenger was less than thrilled with my response. This is when this went from amusing to straight-up harassment. Later that day, I received texts and random inconsistent calls. I tried in English saying that I'm not Juan and that I was messing around. This didn't seem to work, as they kept saying things like, "Liar, I know it's you, and stop trying to hide from me." I decided I was bored and blocked their number. The next day, I get a text from a different number in Spanish telling me to watch yourself and that you're dead. I decided to ignore this and just block the number once again. For a couple of weeks, nothing. I figured they must have figured out that I wasn't the person that they were looking for. But then I get a text, but this time with a picture. I would have dismissed this, but the picture made my stomach a bit queasy. It was a picture of a tattooed man holding a piece of paper with my phone number, Juan's full name, and an address that thankfully wasn't mine, with a message saying in Spanish, "We're coming." What made the picture worse for me was that the man had a tattoo on his face that said MS-13 below his eyes. At this time, I had decided that I had enough and decided to change my number at this point. It made some sense, as I was in a different state anyways. I didn't do anything past this because deep inside, I was hoping this was just a bad joke, and that was being played on either me or Juan. But if not, they didn't find this Juan, or that they find me for that matter. It gives me hope that they didn't have my address, though. In 2 years since this happened, I'm happy to say I haven't been contacted about this since. So, Mr. MS-13 man, let's not ever meet. So I was once living in Copenhagen, a beautiful and very safe city that sometimes has problems with gang shootings, especially immigrant gangs the recent years. I lived in the Not So Posh, at the time, area of Norbro. At that time, it was mostly working class and lots of people on unemployment, which was actually safe to walk most times of the clock, except for a few areas. My best friend lived on one side and I lived on the other. One day we decided to meet up and smoke a joint at the basketball court that is in the border of Majolner Park. Everything goes well, and we were walking away. We talk about how it is a shitty area, and actually none of us have ever had anything bad happen to us. As soon as those words left my mouth, we hear a loud calling, "Hey! Hey, you!" We keep walking without turning, as it is obviously cannot be for us. We don't have any friends there. "Hey, you two, come here." They kept insisting. Here we turn around to see two guys. One big Somalian dude with a teardrop tattoo, and a small Arab bitch that he had. That was a good 20 centimeters taller than me. They catch up to us asking what we're doing there and what area we came from. Blood starts rushing, and as I'm not interested in bragging like a little child, I tell them I am from another ghetto-y area that is well connected in CPH, but I do not know anyone of interest. This dude keeps insisting on us being from a third area that they are currently at war with, and we keep denying it. My friend even tells them he lives nearby, but they are too paranoid and delusional to listen to anything that we say. At one point, the Somalian says, "We will find out what you know now," and I'm like, what the fuck now? So this dude goes a couple of meters away and starts looking into some bushes and pulls out a 9mm, comes up to us, cocks the gun so that we can see that a bullet goes into the chamber and sticks the gun into my stomach. At this point, the only thought going through my mind was, this is gonna hurt so bad. And the only words coming out of my mouth are, "We don't know anyone, man. Leave us alone." At some point, they decide we are not worth it. So my friend gets hit in the ear by the Arab, and I get punched in the nose by the Somalian, and my nose starts bleeding like shit. We walk away all in shock and go back to some of our friends who are possibly affiliated and know that fucker. They are all surprised that we are okay, as the guy is literally insane and might as well have shot us. A couple of months later, I find out he is jailed for attempted murder, and about 3 years ago, I found out that after getting released, in Denmark, you get like 6 years for attempted murder. He was shot and killed by a rival gang. So for once, I am sure that we will never meet. Piece of shit gangster dude. You definitely got what you deserved. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.